Hey friend, in this video, we are going to be talking about all things watercolor ink or liquid watercolor. So in this video, if you've been kind of interested in or maybe dabbling with liquid watercolor, but don't really know where to start or how to mix colors or what it's really good to use for, then this video is going to cover the A to Z, everything you need to know about watercolor inks. I have been a huge fan of liquid watercolor these past few months and have been basically using it all of the time. So if you're ready for the complete beginner's guide to watercolor ink, then let's dive in. To get started, the main difference or what watercolor ink is it's literally very similar to regular ink, like for calligraphy or dip pen. But liquid watercolor is it's like a concentrated dye that, or a pigment-based solution it provides a really, really vibrant, transparent look. So the color can be diluted in water, or you could grab these plastic jars. If you want a lighter hue or a lighter value of the color, you can add water to the pigment that you're dropping in from your bottled jar. They usually come in these bottles like this, or the Winsor & Newton inks that I use don't have the dropper, so I have made sure to buy. We'll link to all of the supplies that I'm talking about in this video in the description. But one of these droppers is really handy if you're going to use these Winsor & Newton inks, because you don't want to just like dump a bunch into these jars or into your mixing wells on your palette. But my favorite brand for watercolor ink, or it's actually acrylic ink, you're just adding water to it, even though it says watercolor ink on it. It's the Aquafine from Daler Rowney is acrylic ink. They have really rich, really vibrant colors. I also love the mixing up some India inks. So not technically watercolor ink, it's India ink, a dye-based solution. But it is really good at spreading and blending. And this Bombay set from Dr. P.H. Martin's has a lot of like really good neutral colors, more like this terracotta is really beautiful. And I also love using the white India ink from the Bombay set to mix up some of these more like creamy pastel colors. So instead of just lightening my purple with water and a lot of water, I added white ink to it. So there's a lot of fun stuff that you can play with these watercolor inks or liquid watercolor. So let's just kind of dive into the main differences between regular watercolor. So from the tube, like a pigment-based tube creamy paint or wells of paint, versus ink or liquid watercolor. One of the main things that before you start using watercolor inks like a pro is to keep in mind a few of the differences. If you're used to painting with regular watercolor, like what you've been using, if you've been watching this channel and all of my videos, I've been mostly using, my Winsor & Newton professional level watercolors like in this palette. But if you're used to using regular watercolor like that and you switch to liquid watercolor or inks, there's a few differences that you'd want to watch out for. And one of those main differences is going to be, well, obviously the way it comes in bottles and mixing it in jars or in your palette. But one of those main differences is going to be lifting, and that's going to apply to how much you mix in your jars and why I use these plastic jars. So with my Winsor & Newton professional level watercolor paint, as you can see, these are dried cakes or paints in my palette, and I can re-wet them and activate them again and still use them. However, with watercolor ink, if I go to the palettes that I've been using with my inks mixed up, this is from about a week ago. You cannot pick up, you can get a tiny bit of hue. I have that left over from my Opera Rose that I just grabbed from my regular watercolor, but you will not be able to re-wet and activate watercolor inks. So that's why when you are adding watercolor ink like straight from the bottle into a palette, you want to make sure that you're only going a little bit at a time, because if it dries and you're not going to. So if you waste, or if you put in a lot of paint in your palette and you don't use it all, it's going to be kind of sad, because then you won't be able to, you've wasted that paint. So that's why I like to put my mixtures that I'm liking. So a bunch of these are like combinations of different brands and different colors from those brands. And I didn't want to do it in my palette because I wanted a big mixture of it. So I mix it up in these plastic jars, and then I can screw on the lid really tightly so that it doesn't dry out and I can have it for long periods of time. And so I will use these jars where I can use my dropper and drop in little bits in my palette if I want to mix up a second hue with it, like add white to it or add green or whatever I want to do. Or I'll just use it straight from the jar and go straight to my paper. So that is one thing to keep in mind. And along with that is lifting color. So lifting color with regular watercolor can be relatively easy. So I can use a damp brush or dry brush or a paper towel, and I can lift off or soften some of this color. If I were to re-wet this pink, this regular watercolor paint, I could probably get the majority of it off with my damp brush or a paper towel or something to lift it off with. So lifting color with regular watercolor is very easy. But with these dyes or this liquid watercolor, it's almost impossible. Especially the more saturated or dense the color is, especially the drier it gets. So I'm able to do it a little bit, but it's way more difficult than with regular paint. So one of the main reasons I've been using watercolor inks these days, like pretty much the majority of the time that I've been painting because I'm enjoying it so much, is the vibrancy of color. It's so intense. The colors are so intense. This is Tangerine from the Winsor & Newton set. The colors are so intense and beautiful and just like really, really rich. There's just you might not be able to see it on camera. If I were to do this, obviously it's not the same exact color. This is Tangerine, and the most vibrant orange I have with my regular watercolor paint is Cadmium Orange from Winsor & Newton. So it's the same brand, but obviously a different color. But this is a very vibrant orange as well. But regular watercolor paint just has like a little bit more of a milkiness to it, not as milky as gouache. But I've been freaking out about liquid watercolor lately because of how intense the color is. If I wanted to mix up a different hue with this color, I would either take a clean brush, or this is, dried paint in there, so I'm not worried about it, or my dropper, and get that hair out of there. I have my warm colors that I'm going to mix in here, and this will be my palette for my cool colors just for liquid watercolor. I'm not doing anything else in these palettes, no gouache, no regular watercolor. I want to keep it clean because I want to explore having those mediums separate. So this is where I had another mixture of Tangerine here, but I can't re-wet this like I said. So keep in mind, if you have a mixture from the day before or something that's dried, you won't be able to re-wet it and use that. It's dried in there. So I'm just gonna drop in, and remember these colors are really intense. So you only need a couple drops, like 3 or 4 drops. And let's say, I'm gonna put the rest back in that jar. Let's say I want like a light peach color. So I'm gonna grab my white India ink. I love this. It's watery white milkiness. And this white is powerful too. So I'm going to do about 1 drop, maybe 2 drops in there. So I'm doing it all in my well. But if it's a color that I know I'm going to use very frequently, then I'm going to mix up with a clean jar, a plastic jar. I'm going to mix up a bigger batch. But for these smaller batches, I just do just a really small amount in my well. So now I'm adding just a touch of pink, just straight from the jar on my paintbrush because I have this cleaned up brush. And that's looking nice. You can add water to it just like regular watercolor to lighten the value of the color. But I like making these colors a little bit more creamy with the white India ink. So now we have this beautiful pinky peach velvety color. And when I lighten it on my brush, ooh, that's nice. We get that bright pink under the orange. Like that. Another thing that I've been loving about watercolor inks, or something to keep in mind if you're painting with watercolor inks, is wet and wet technique. This is the bread and butter of liquid watercolor, is using wet and wet technique. Wet and dry, you can still obviously achieve great results because it's a transparent medium and you can layer and all of that. However, I will say I don't like using this medium if I'm painting more realistically. Watercolor inks, I am a huge fan for my loose florals, stuff where I'm, this is a super, super fun and vibrant, rich indigo color that I used. I laid down water and just the shadowy shapes of flowers and branches and leaves, and then punched in color. And this blue just kind of sprints off, and it takes over the water. And it's really fun to watch. So that is the sweet spot for watercolor inks or liquid watercolor, is wet and wet technique. But for, realistic, where you're building layer upon layer and you're wanting to see blends or like soft blending between midtones and shadows and highlights, it's not as ideal as regular watercolor. So it can be done, but the medium of choice there would be regular watercolor. But for my loose style florals or abstracts or anything else like that, I am going to grab for my watercolor inks now because I'm a huge fan of how it blends. It just absolutely explodes and takes over. So if I were to show you a little example of a similar floral piece to what I just brought into the frame, I have a filbert brush and I'm just going to lay down some water, and I don't really care that there's like a pinky color in this water, because I'm going to show you how that blue just kind of takes over. So I'm just going to paint in 2 little flowers over here, and I'm wetting my surface. So I'm wetting the surface of my paper. I'm using a lot of water, and I'm okay if there's like little droplets that fall onto where I'm painting, because I'm just gonna make it or turn it into a leaf. But I'm making sure this stays really wet. And then I'm just going straight to my blue color because I know that's the blue I want to use. If I wanted to darken it with like black ink or something, I could and do that in my well. But I'm just going to use this color as is and kind of swipe off in the jar because this is a very dense and intense color. So this color just kind of, when you punch it in there, runs off and takes over. With regular watercolor paint, you would still see a bloom like that, but it wouldn't be as explosive. It just really spreads so nicely, watercolor inks. And I'm a huge fan of how it diffuses, how it spreads. You'll still obviously have this problem if you use too much water where it's pooling. So you want to make sure that with watercolor inks, because it'll dry like really intense hard lines, you're making sure to work that in and help it out a little bit. But this color, or watercolor inks in general, are just magic upon magic. Obviously, watercolor by itself is magical when it spreads and blooms, but there's something about watercolor inks that makes it so intense and it just kind of runs off and does its thing. And I'm a huge fan of that. Okay, so I talked about lifting and staining. It's a very staining medium, so be careful. I talked about wet and wet technique. So if I were to sit down and actually paint something, I'm going to show you what my process is for mixing colors, getting pigments into my actual mixing wells, and the start to finish process of how I would paint something. So I'm going to get a clean sheet of paper. All right, so I've got this really nice creamy peach here. I'm going to use also this orange tangerine color by itself, but I want to mix up some greens with this turquoise. Strong boy. So this turquoise, I already have like white and some turquoise and cobalt in here from a bunch of different brands, but I'm going to lighten it just a little bit more. I know I want like a lighter, so I'm going to put all my blues and greens in this one. I know I want like a lighter turquoise, so I'm just going to grab a little bit of that color, and that's about it. Maybe add some water to it and white. Like a very pale turquoise, and then I'm going to have a really intense turquoise as a couple of my cool colors. So I'm mixing that in. Real nice. So if you're wondering how this color will look on paper, this is why I like to test out my colors, and I have test swatches on each one of my jars. I might go ahead and test this out on a scrap sheet of paper and make sure I like, that's so dope. Make sure I like the transparency, the actual hue, and the value. So if I add just a little bit of water to it, it gets really transparent and almost milky transparency, which is nice. So I'm going to leave it as is. Try to get rid of all of the excess pigment that I have on my brush so I don't waste any into that mixing well, and then move on to a different color. So I'm probably going to grab a different brush for a light pink that I'm going to add just pink from this Winsor & Newton color. It's like a vermilion pink, I think is what it's called. And add some water to it and a touch of white. This color by itself is going to be used too in my painting, but I want like a creamy version of it too. So I'm adding my white India ink, 2 touches, let's say. Mixing that in. That's dope. Kind of looks like Pepto-Bismol color, which is fine. I really like it. In a different context, I like it, especially next to this turquoise. Bomb. Really bomb. Ooh, look at this. This color palette. Very cool. Okay, and now I want like a really limey, almost sage undertone green. So I need to go and get another jar. All right, so I'm gonna mix up another green in here, kind of like a limey yellow ochre undertone. This is yellow ochre. I think this is from the Daler Rowney set. I'm just gonna grab a nice little blob. And I do want some turquoise in it, but I don't want that milky turquoise with the white. So I'm gonna probably mix up the pure version of this green over here and then see also what it looks like with that milky turquoise, since there's some droplets in this little well right here. Yeah, that's a little too like muted and gray. So I'm gonna grab just a tiny bit of that blue. It's so intense. You want to add it kind of gradually. So maybe I'm going to swipe that off because these are such intense colors. I'm going to add more water. Such intense colors. And yes, I have a little bit of that yellow ochre on my brush, but I'm not too worried about it. Getting in that blue color. And then let's maybe see what it looks like with a more vibrant blue green. Now it's becoming a little bit more green like I want. So another touch of that turquoise. That's good. It's like, oh boy, still very wet. That's really nice. So I love that we have this like really natural green color and then all of these like more, you know, childlike whimsical pinks and turquoise and blues. So it's going to be a really nice complement. And then one more green I want to do is with, the majority is going to be with this really intense blue color. And just a touch of this yellow ochre. Let's see how much we would need to add. So that's a nice like smoky blue, but I want it to be green. So I'm going to add a bit more yellow ochre. Because yellow and blue makes green. And I like it. I like it. So we've got some good greens in this palette over here. And then obviously we'll use this blue and we'll use that blue. Now I might want a little bit of a really pale purple. So I'm going to grab some of this pink. Let's put it in a well that I had purple from the other day. Again, you can't lift this color underneath because it's dry. Make it a little bit more purple, just touch of that blue, and then maybe one drop of our white. I'm not going to use this color as often as the pinks and oranges, so I don't have as big of a mixture in my well. That's nice. So here's our palette. We've got this creamy orange, orange by itself, this like light Pepto-Bismol color, and that pink by itself that I'm super running low on. Muted soft purple. We've got a really nice light turquoise, kind of a muted yellow ochre if we want to use that. A sagey light green and a darker, more eucalyptus color. So our greens are a bit more of like natural tones, and then our warm colors are more intense and vibrant. So because I've got these colors mixed up, I don't want them to dry on me, because once they dry, they are not going to be usable. So I'm going to work pretty quickly and do like a few flowers. If I'm painting for a licensing job, I'll just paint elements by itself like I have on this sheet of paper. But if it's something that I want like a finished piece, either for a print or I want it to just look more tangled like this, then I will do it all at once and together. So for my flowers, whenever I'm using liquid watercolor, I kind of like to start with just water first and then build up in color. So I'm going to paint kind of like a biggish blooming peony. You're not going to be able to see it that well at first because I'm just using water, but I'm using a filbert brush and using the top edge of the brush for the top of the petal, and I'm using the side of it at times and creating like this ball shape with these petals. If you don't know how to paint a peony, make sure you go check out a bunch of my other videos. I have tons of tutorials on flowers, different flowers, even peonies, so make sure you check it out. But I'm just laying down the initial shape of the flower first with just water, and then I'm going to plug in my color. And I'm going to start with my more like softer white undertone colors first, and start with just plugging them in first, kind of just touching some of the corners. I might go in and actually create more petals with that color on my brush. I'm liking that, but I like to create a lot of movement between multiple colors. That orange blends so nice. So I still have some of that color on my brush, but I'm just going to go in and just grab a little dab of that tangerine color by itself and punch that in over here. Maybe over here. So it's just kind of a random dance between the colors I have mixed up in my palette over here and going straight from the jar. Sometimes I just feel like there needs to be a more intense color in certain areas where it's maybe at the base of petals or at the top of petals, or I need to break up some of that orange with some pink. But overall, I just like watching these colors blend and bleed with one another and create these fun color rivers, really. It's not about making sure it looks exactly like a peony or exactly like whatever I'm painting. It's more about how are the colors blending with one another and creating really fun moments, almost like tie-dye or marbling. And when I'm mixing my greens, just like letting that pink from the peony flow into my leaf. And maybe just going straight into my darker greens with my other green on my brush to mix that in there. I might even want a green that's a little bit more yellow. So I'm just kind of always mixing with these colors and trying to use what I think is the best quality of this medium, which is blending and mixing and wet. So trying to work quickly. And I'm starting to see right here at this ball, I want to pop in like a really dark red. So I've got this huge amount of red in here. I'm going to drop in. And I love that. Might do it right here as well to show some of those individual petals. Now that's going to bleed and blend nice and softly into the pink and just be on the edge, which is super lovely. Then we can kind of grab our purple and maybe do another smaller peony over here. Maybe grab some of that pink too to introduce that color on this flower. And I love that petal touching that green leaf. That is dope. Gonna let it do its thing and not touch it again. So this one's more of a pastel-y flower. So I'm not gonna touch it too much with any vibrant colors, like really intense vibrant colors like this one. Just in a couple areas, I'm gonna pop in this orange. And this right here is gonna dry with a lot of veiny look to it. So I'm gonna grab just a clean, damp brush and soften that a little bit, help it out. Because that's one thing with watercolor inks is they do, because they're so intense, there are moments where they won't dry as smooth or blend as smoothly. Usually it's pretty good, but there will be moments, especially when you're mixing in the white India ink with some of your colors. Grabbing some of that pure pink just for this edge over here. So obviously I'm just painting flowers right now, but all of these notes I'm making or adding in certain colors or helping it blend a little bit more, this can all be applied to anything that you would paint with liquid watercolor, whether it's a landscape, portraits, florals, because you're working with the same medium, and you're going to have in landscapes, you're going to have bigger, broader strokes like for your skies or oceans. And so you're going to have this fun ability to see really intense movement between color and water and various pigments. But you're still going to have those times where you need to help it blend a little bit. My process would be the exact same though, of mixing colors in a well and in jars, depending on how much of it I want and all of that. We haven't used this turquoise yet, so let's pop that in somewhere. Maybe I'll just use it as like a little fluffy moment. So as you can see, there's a lot of similarities between liquid watercolor and regular watercolor, especially if you're using wet and wet technique. However, the intensity of the color is going to be the main difference. It's so vibrant, so intense, and I'm obsessed. That's the direction that I love, especially with my licensing work. And the blooms and blending between color. It's like nothing else can compare to it with regular watercolor paint. There are going to be moments like up here, this red got blocked by some more drier pink color, where you'll have like really intense veining that you still get with regular watercolor paint. It's just not as intense. So that's something to keep in mind, along with the staining and lifting aspect of watercolor inks. They're more staining. So all of these colors that I just mixed in my palette, they're going to dry eventually and I won't be able to use them. So if you're adding color to a mixing well like this, just make sure you're going at it very gradually and trying to aim for getting the amount that you will be using on your paper. But in general, having the right brands or colors and tools, you'll need a few extra tools. Like I already mentioned, the dropper, the jars, and the mixing wells, separating them, because these colors, the main beauty of these colors is their intensity. So if you're mixing warm and cool colors, you're going to blend in contrasting colors, which is going to make for a murkier look to your color. So, which is fine. You can, go for more muted or murkier looking colors. But the main advantage to using watercolor inks, I think, is how intense and vibrant the colors are. And so that's why I like to keep it separate so that my pinks stay really vibrant and clean in pink. And same with my turquoises and blues and greens. So there you have it, the complete A to Z beginner's guide to watercolor inks. It is a super fun medium. I'm obsessed. Hope you loved it. Thank you so much for watching. I hope that was helpful for you. I hope you learned a thing or two about watercolor ink. If you've tried out watercolor ink before and maybe have used a different brand or method, or I forgot about something, drop it in the comments below. I'm sure your comment will be super helpful for other people checking out the comments to see and check out those brands that you mentioned, or maybe other techniques that you use it for, etc. But again, I hope that was helpful. If you need further resources on all things watercolor, make sure you check out the rest of my videos on this channel, obviously, like the Complete Beginner's Guide to Watercolor, just regular watercolor. And I have some free resources for you linked in the description. You can check out my free floral watercolor ebook download, my watercolor book, Everyday Watercolor, that's available on Amazon, along with Everyday Watercolor Flowers, and a bunch of other stuff that I have for you. So make sure you check out all of those links that we have in the description and all of the links to the supplies that I used in this video. As always, thank you so much for watching. All the engagement and love means the world, and I'll see you in the next video.